Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome, welcome. Very exciting distinguished speaker series webinar coming up shortly. So again, thank you for taking time to join. My name is Prashant Joshi. I'm your host today, and we have, of course, a very distinguished speaker. So Professor Subhash Kak is again, an eminent scholar of computer science and Vedanta. So he's a scientist, a historian, who's a Regents Professor at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma. He hails from Kashmir, India originally, and he has held various visiting appointments in Britain and Australia. His research includes AI and history and philosophy of science. His work has been showcased in the popular media such as Discovery and History channels, PBS, public TV in Europe, and in several documentaries on science and art. He's the author of 30 books, of which the most recent is Eternal Bharat, Truth, Meaning, and Beauty. He's a member of the Indian Prime Minister's Science and Technology and Innovation Advisory Council. So again, we have a very distinguished speaker today, and what he'll be talking about is the Vedantic knowledge and quantum physics, which you may feel are completely two different spectrums, but his talk will summarize the essentials of Vedanta and quantum physics and show how they're philosophically identical. So without further ado, Subhash Kakji, welcome. Thank you for your time, and welcome to Vayu.
Thank you, Prashantji. I am delighted to be speaking to the Vayu audience across the world on this most fascinating topic of the parallels between mechanics and Vedanta. Now, of course, what Sanatan Dharma ultimately is about is Vedanta. Sanatan Dharma has many views of looking at reality, including analysis, that is logic, and Vaisheshika, which is the structure, the physical structure of the universe, Sankhya, which are the various psychological categories. And then you also have Mimamsa, and finally Vedanta. So Vedanta is the overarching view of reality, and we want to show that it is identical to the deepest scientific theory that is, which is quantum mechanics. And don't take my word for it. This is the conclusion that the leading philosophers of science have reached. And this statement that quantum mechanics is entirely consistent with Vedanta, you'll find in many, many books by Western scholars, by the leading historians and experts on quantum mechanics. So this is something that more people need to know about. Why? First of all, quantum mechanics is the deepest theory of science. It's the most fundamental theory, and without quantum mechanics, you cannot explain physics. And without physics, you can't explain chemistry. Of course, quantum mechanics is a part of physics. And without chemistry and quantum mechanics, you can't explain biology. And you need all of that to study the brain. So this is the foundation on which the entire structure of modern sciences rests. Now, somebody might say, in what sense is quantum mechanics different from classical mechanics or classical physics? In classical physics, you talk about motions of objects and so on, like by Newton's laws and so on. But the observer doesn't have a role. The observer is always outside of the system. While in quantum mechanics, the observer also participates. And that changes everything, because in some sense, classical mechanics is in terms of philosophical traditions where the observer is not crucial to the definition of the system. And in fact, as we know, classical mechanics has been used by some old religions, Western religions, to explain their theology. Their theology comes in from the back door, so to speak. Now, in quantum mechanics, you also have a place for the observer, although quantum mechanics also, just like classical mechanics, cannot explain that observer. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, now somebody might say, well, what is quantum mechanics? It sounds rather forbidding, difficult. Quantum mechanics has only two main principles, and anybody can get them. And in fact, in the next 4 minutes, I'll give you a primer on quantum mechanics. The two axioms are, first of all, at the deepest level, uh, reality or nature consists of all possibilities, including possibilities which are mutually exclusive. So if you were to imagine us in that state, at the most foundational state, then the individual would be wearing all the shirts that they have of different colors and all the shoes of different colors at the same time. And this is called superposition. But the second axiom of quantum mechanics is that when you interact with such a physical system, you have access to only one of those elements of the superposition state. So, in other words, you might have been before you observed yourself, you might have been wearing 100 different shirts of different hues and colors and 20 different pairs of shoes. But the moment you observe yourself, you have access to only one of those states. Now, this is, of course, rather subtle, and people have been debating this for a long time, and many, many books have been written on this to understand what it really means as far as the mind is concerned. But this is straightforward in Vedanta. And what is Vedanta? Vedanta, in two lines, is that there is physical reality which is governed by laws. And these laws are called rhythm or rit, rit from ritu, seasons, because seasons change, they come one after another with regularity. So there is a law behind that. So rhythm or rit is the general law of nature. So everything is by law, including what we do. And what we do is based on karmic law, the temperament that you're born with, what we inherit, and what sanskars we get as we are growing up. And that determines how we are going to live. And really, we have no freedom. And that's why we speak of karma being so powerful, accepting that. Uh, so, this is one side. The other side is Atma. Atma is not a product of this embodied reality. Atma is para. And this para in English would be transcendent. It transcends the body. And as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, I am Atma in every life, life being, in every creature. I am the Atma in that creature. So what is Atma? Atma is the observing awareness that we all possess. Now, for some time in quantum mechanics, uh, theorists tried to show that perhaps Atma, which means the experimenter, the observer, could also be derived by the two axioms of quantum mechanics that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, but they have failed. And the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is called the Copenhagen interpretation, doesn't look into it. It only says there is observers and there is the physical system, and they are sort of apart from each other. They are like two sides of the coin. And that is precisely what Vedanta says. Vedanta says that Atma and embodied reality are two sides of the same coin. So Atma is everywhere. It interpenetrates everything. And Atma cannot be derived from the physical body, from the sharir. And in fact, if you read Vedanta textbooks like the Brahma Sutras or the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, and this is repeated again and again, that Atma is independent, it's para, it cannot be derived from the body. Because if it were to be derived from the body, then it'll be a property of the body. It's not a property of the body. And you would be glad to know that 2 years ago, I was able to prove it mathematically using quantum mechanics itself that consciousness is not a property of the body, and consciousness interpenetrates the whole cosmos. It is transcendent, which becomes, therefore, a proof, a mathematical proof of Vedanta. So now let me go back. So what we are saying is that all of modern science rests on Vedanta, rests on quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics is equivalent to Vedanta philosophically. And now, of course, we're not saying that the axioms of quantum mechanics or the mathematical framework was created by the Vedic rishis. They were talking in generalities. They were talking of Atma. They're talking of nature, Prakriti, its laws, evolution and involution, and so on. But they're not talking of it mathematically. Now, what happened in the 20th century that inspired partly by Vedanta? In fact, one of the two creators of quantum mechanics was an Austrian Vedantin named Erwin Schrödinger, who, in his own autobiography, claims that the central idea of quantum mechanics came to him from Vedanta, from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman, which is within us or which is us, is equivalent to Brahma, which is the entire cosmos, entire reality. And he said the moment he understood it, he realize that the underlying reality must be a superposition of all possibilities. And I told you that is one of the two axioms. The other axiom being that when you access this reality, you can get only one of its components, which is also a part of Vedanta, because in Vedanta, what you have, let's first of all try to make sense of how do we see ourselves in Vedanta. And I will um, um, contrast that with the Western view. In the Western view, we have the body and we have various complex interconnections, say in the brain, and there are electrical signals going back and forth in the brain, and the brain consists of an astronomical number of neurons. And it's out of that that the mind emerges. The mind emerges out of the complexity of neurons. So all that you have is the body and the mind, which is a product of the brain, which is why in Western medicine also, since the mind is a product of the brain, Western medicine only deals with the body, principally only deals with the body. In fact, the name for Western medicine, the formal name is allopathy. And allopathy means treatment of symptoms. So you have a symptom, you have an ache, so you get something, you have a high blood pressure, you get something, etc., etc. Uh, since there are only two. Now, of course, there are certain acute mental diseases where they say, okay, maybe there's a imbalance in the body or in the brain. So maybe if you get this chemical or there's this imbalance, then we treat it. But it's treated as an afterthought. Now, the Vedantic model of the mind is different. It is not um, two-layered as in the Western model or Western thinking. It is three-layered. You have, first of all, the body, which is also called the Sthul Sharir, which is the gross body, the physical body. It's also called the Annamaya Kosha, Annamaya, built out of Anna, of food. Now, above the Sthul Sharir is the Sukshma Sharir. Sukshma Sharir is where your mind is. Most of the mind is, not entirely. And that's where your chitta is, your memories are, and your intellect is, buddhi is. So everybody has sense organs, senses, and you take in data, and then you organize this data one way or the other, and you use your intellect to process and understand this data. Now, this is something very similar to also what machines do, because now machines can do a lot of processing, and that machines can even drive cars because they can also get this information about the opposite lane, and they know where their own lane is by the white lines. Then they learn how to keep within their lane, which is a kind of what the intellect does. So this is the second layer. But the third layer, which the Buddhists also share with the Sanatana Dharma tradition, and the third layer is called the Karan Sharir. Karan meaning causal, Karan meaning where your ahankar is based, your ego is based, and that ego is a product of certain um, fundamental um, tendencies that you have based on your personality that you're born with, which is the genetic inheritance that you have obtained. And of course, somebody might say that, well, we can go back into the previous history of this individual in previous births, but that's not central to it. The central to it is the idea that you have this third layer, the Karan Sharir, and in the Karan Sharir, you have your Ahankar, and so you have a black box which the mind doesn't have access to, because the mind cannot interrogate itself. And it's to study the current Sharir of oneself that there are various yogic practices. The yogic practices allow you to go beyond your mind, beyond manas, into your current Sharir, and beyond the current Sharir is Atma. Now, and that's where the difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, or academic Buddhism and and Hinduism is, or Sanatan Dharma is, that academic Buddhism says there is no Atma, while Sanatan Dharma says there is Atma. And as I've told you, that is central to Vedanta, and that is something that my theorem has also established, that indeed consciousness is not a product of the body, of the activity in the body. Okay, so now you have out of Vedanta emerging, because of this three-layered structure, a three-layered approach also to health. In contrast to allopathy, where you're only treating symptoms, Ayurveda, which is the corresponding science of health, of well-being, of ayu, of maintaining ayu, is that the body is a system in balance, in system in harmony. And because a lot of the illnesses are a consequence of the imbalance between the systems within the body, and there are three doshas, and the imbalance in the three doshas makes the body susceptible to outside agents, meaning germs, etc. And therefore, one of the primary efforts of the Ayurvedic Vadya is to bring the body into harmony. And so if there is too much of, you have kapha, pitta, and vayu. So pitta is like fire, vayu is like air, and kapha is like water. So if there is an imbalance, you try to correct it. And this imbalance also leads to an influence on the way the patient's mind works, because there's a mind-body connection. Everybody knows it. It's common sense, because if there was no mind-body connection, then a person in extreme shock would not die. Hearing some terrible news, some people die. So there's something that they receive in their mind. The body says, I'm going to die, right? So in the Western tradition, the Western classical tradition, you can't explain that at all. So here, then you have a more sophisticated system. And once again, there is a mathematical basis to it, which people in the field of logic have known for 50, 60 years. And the mathematical theorem is that three-sided logic is superior to binary logic. Allopathy is based, or Western way of looking at the mind and of looking at reality is based on binary logic, right? You have mind and body, while the Vedantic view of looking at reality is ternary, meaning three-sided logic, because you have, as I said, three aspects to the physical body, the sthul, the sukshma, and the karan sharir, and the atma. The atma, of course, we view it as above the sukshma sharir, as the above this karan sharir, but it actually interpenetrates everywhere. The atma is present everywhere. So because it's para meaning it's out beyond space, time, matter, complex. Now, there's something else which is very interesting that I want to talk about, again from quantum mechanics, with parallels in Vedanta. And in fact, in the mid 1970s, 1977 to be exact, a very famous leading quantum theorist of Indian origin named George Sudarshan. Some of you may have heard his name, and his student named Misra, I forget his first name. They published a paper where they argued that in physics, um, normally what you do, what the experimenter does, has no influence on the physical system, right? The experimenter, there's a table where the whole experimental setup is located, and then the experimenter, who's the physicist, does various things, puts in some signals, etc., and gets something outside. But the normal understanding is that he's always outside of the system. But now George Sudarshan and Misra were able to show that just by the fact of observation, the evolution of the physical system can be changed and controlled. And they published a paper on it in 1977 called the quantum Zeno effect. And after that, any number of papers have been published on it, and it's been shown to be true in the lab. And this is something where people would be winning Nobel Prizes and so on. So this is a very well-established field that consciousness can actually control the physical system, which is rather surprising because by common sense, one wouldn't have thought of it. Now, does Vedanta have something like this? Now, I forgot to tell you that George Sudarshan, whom I knew very well, was also a Vedantin. Now, Vedanta has spoken of it for a long time, for centuries. In Vedanta, you have something called the Drishti Srishti Vada. Drishti meaning observation, Srishti meaning creation. Observation, creation, theory. That's what Drishti Srishtivada is. And the background to it is that since I told you that in Vedanta, everything is according to law, according to uh, principles, natural principles, then where does Ishwar come in? We say Ishwar is the sense of divinity within us. And I did admit that we don't have any freedom unless, as in the very famous statement um, from the Vedantic tradition, Aham Brahmasmi. This is from the Upanishads. Aham Brahmasmi, or I am Atma Brahma, which meaning I am Brahman, which means I have everything. I have all freedom, because the only person, the only entity who has freedom is not the individual, is not the jiva, but it is the purush. And the purush doesn't mean the male. Purush means the Atman within you. And another statement to the same effect is Shivoham. I am Shiva. Aham Shivaha. That I am Shiva, and Shiva represents freedom. Consciousness is free. The physical embodiments are not free. So this is a debate that's been going on within the Vedantic tradition. And so people said, well, if everything is according to rhythm, according to physical laws, then what's the place for Ishwar? And the answer was, Ishwar creates the universe through drishti. So this is the background to drishti srishti vad, that by observation, just by sankalpa, in human activities, you can speak of it as sankalpa. By sankalpa, you can set into motion a whole series of events which include not just you, but everybody around you, so that you will be successful, that you have truly, truly embraced in your heart as something that you want to do. And here is another connection between Vedanta and quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, you have an idea of entanglement. Two objects which are even far apart, and it just flows out of the two axioms that I mentioned. You're all quantum theorists now. Uh, um, a, um, a conclusion and inference from these axioms of superposition and collapse of the function is that objects which are very far apart can still remain connected. And that's called entanglement. And this is something on which hundreds of books have been written. How can two objects, let's say an electron on Earth and an electron on Moon, remain entangled when they are so far away, and not just Moon, on another galaxy? And the moment you do something to one, a corresponding effect will manifest itself in the other particle that it's entangled with. And even bigger objects could be entangled. And because um, uh, energy would not have the time to move from one place to another, because this happens instantaneously. And we know in physics, one principle is that no physical body can travel greater than the speed of light. So this seems to go counter to it. And since Atma is present everywhere, therefore this entanglement, and this entanglement is also mentioned in another great Vedantic book called Brihad Aranyak Upanishad, where there's a dialogue between Gargi and Yagyavalkya. Gargi is the disciple of Yagyavalkya, and she asks Yagyavalkya various questions. She says, why is it that Akasha is separate from Vayu, or Vayu is separate from Agni? You have five elements of which the physical universe is constituted, which are Prithvi, Apaha, Agni or Tejas. The next is Vayu, and then the next is Akash. So Gargi asks Yagyavalkya, how are they separate? And Yagyavalkya says, no, they're not separate. Actually, Akash is also present in Vayu, and an element of it is also present in Agni, and so on. And they are oth-prot. And the word oth-prot means entangle. In fact, that's the word that he uses in Sanskrit. He says all these elements are oth-prot. And oth-prot within all of them is also Atma, because Atma is present everywhere. And as you can see, it's a very subtle concept. You really have to switch your mode of understanding to really feel it to your bones. And then everything changes, because what does it do? Normally, if you don't do yoga, yoga chitta vritti nirodha, that is the very first sutra in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Chitta vritti, the modifications in your chitta, in your mind, memory of the mind, all the modifications, because there's random stuff going on. If you can calm it, then this Atma, which is like a light, illuminating the contents of your mind. So this is Vedanta. In Vedanta, uh, consciousness is like a light. It's not this light, the ordinary light. It's another light which illuminates the contents of the mind. Now, if everybody has access to this light, then you might ask, why are the capacities of different people different? Well, two reasons. One, uh, some people, due to the happy circumstance of the right genes, and also having been raised in the right environment and educated the right way, have learned uh, to remove the covers. There are covers which stop all this light coming into the brain, which is where the mind is located. The mind is an instrument, it's the inner instrument, antahkaran. So the mind is an instrument, all right, but this instrument's powers become weak because this mind does not, um, what the mind does is you have consciousness, which is this light, and this mind reflects this light. Now, so the mind is like a mirror, and this mirror is all dusty and dirty, or if there is even a sheet of thin cloth lying on it, or if you picture it as a surface of water, if there are eddies or there are waves in it, then the light will all get broken and you won't make sense. You won't understand what's really going on, and you need that light in all its clarity to understand reality as it is. And so um, the key is education, and in this there's also certain personal effort required, because we are born, when we are born, we start off by accepting that we are really primarily bodies as children. And that's why we are told certain stories which help us, which inspire us to go beyond that particular view, as in the Sanatan tradition. So, uh, so then, once we learn how to calm our mind uh, and relate to things around us in the right way, that's when that light reaches you fully. And when that light reaches you fully, you are free, because you're not free so long as you are under the control of your own ahankar, your own ego. But the moment you let go and go beyond that current sharir, because the current sharir is under your ego. So the moment you let go, you have access to that light in all its glory, and that moment makes you free. And that's what mukti is, that's what moksha is. And then you have access to amazing creativity. In fact, that's how creativity occurs. In fact, there have been a lot of research also on creative people, and they've been asked, how did you think of what you did think? And they always, literally in all cases, they say, well, we were really not thinking of it. It happened spontaneously. The idea came from nowhere. Or I was sleeping, I saw a dream, or I was dozing off, and suddenly I got this idea from somewhere. And in the Vedantic tradition, as in Mandukya Upanishad, it's stated that when you're dreaming, when you're not fully awake, that's when you have access to what is called Hiranya Garbha, which means the golden womb of all possibilities. Because between consciousness, between this light and between your mind, that current sharir has all these layers, or all the eddies and the storm related to your bhavanas and so on, emerging through your emotions, through your desire to dominate, to control, to possess, and they all occlude that light. They prevent that light to fall on your mind, and the moment you let it happen, or it's sort of counterintuitive, the moment you let go and the moment you realize that it's not your ego which is arriving at that particular beautiful insight, the moment you do that, you'll get that insight. The moment you think you are doing it, you will not have that insight. You see that? Totally counterintuitive. The more uh, you truly in your bones admit that you're only nimitta, you're only a medium, the more you will be able to access that Shakti, that creativity that is within each individual. And the more you think that it's you, the moment you think it's you, it's your ahankar, it's your asuric aspect. The asuric aspect is that aspect where you think you are the doer. And every human being has some aspect of that. And it's, you know, out of that unity comes this duality, where you have Prakriti and and Prakriti and Purush, which is the body and consciousness. So out of that duality, you need to do a manthan, a churning, in order to become one with the devas. This is manthan between the asuras and the suras, or the asuras and the devas within each one of you. This churning takes place not only at the cosmic level, as the story goes, the story of Samudra Manthan goes, it also happens within each individual. And within that, after that churning, and that process of churning, of course, is sort of full of pain and suffering, which is also the process of churning in learning quantum mechanics. When you're doing physics or any other scientific subject, it's not as easy because you have to go through the whole process of the mathematical formalism and those equations and all that. But if you can survive it, then at the end, you have this wonderful insight, which, as I've mentioned, is identical to the insight that the Vedic rishis already provided to us so many thousand years ago. Now, let me also add one more point, and this is related to lifespan. And this is something that I've been thinking about very recently, and I just this week published a paper on it called Time, Consciousness, and Lifespan. Now, as I mentioned, George Sudarshan's paper of 1977 showed that you could control, by observation alone, you could control the evolution of a physical system. Now, of course, this is a microscopic. This is not a actual physical system. It's a microscopic system. You're looking at a very at an elemental situation. You're talking of atoms and photons and light and this and that. So you could also freeze the evolution of a system, which means that you can stop the passage of time by observation alone. And so the idea came to me that maybe you could also do this physically for a larger body. In the larger body, like yours and mine and of an animal, we have two kinds of systems. One are the physiological systems, which are controlled by their own physiological processes, but there's also an independent, a parallel informational system, which reports to the mind. So the argument that can be made is that through dhyan, through observation. What is dhyan? Dhyan is observation of the mind, which is concentration. Dhyan means concentration. It doesn't mean meditation. I think that's a kind of a incorrect translation that's generally done. So through observation of the mind, you can change the evolution of the physiological process within the mind, and therefore you can slow down the aging process. And in fact, that would then explain how many yogis, there are many stories, and some stories are, in fact, with scientific confirmation. There are many stories of yogis who have lived very, very long time. And this is something that anybody could do. And in fact, one of the most famous stories, which is also quoted in a book called The Future of Life, I believe, by Michael Murphy. And he quotes this thing which happened in the 1830s when Maharaja Ranjit Singh was ruling Punjab. And there was an English resident or a doctor also based in Lahore. And there was this yogi, he comes in and he says, and he told the Maharaja in his court, and the Englishman was there, he says, you can bring me in for a month, and I'll be able to stop all my physical processes, and after that I'll still be alive. And he throws a challenge, and the Maharaja says, okay, let's do this. And the doctor goes there and he looks at the entire system that is constructed. So what they do is they make a room of bricks and they completely seal it. And the doctor claims that he saw it. This whole story is published in a scientific journal of the 19th century. And I also quoted it, at least referenced it in my latest lifespan article. So, and you can Google it. So they break this person up, and he gets into a yogic posture. And 1 month passes, and of course, the Maharaja uh, places guards around it so that no hanky-panky could go on. And after 1 month, with the Maharaja and this doctor and others in attendance, the Darbar in attendance, this whole structure is broken, and they find that this guy is sitting totally lifeless and totally cold. But then his disciples come and they start rubbing him, and in some time, in half an hour, he's fine again. He's awakened again. And this is something that the bears do, for example. In hibernation, there's a certain gene which controls hibernation. So, and that humans have that gene too, but it doesn't work. So maybe there could even be a physiological explanation for it. But in any event, this is something which is a part of yoga. You can also control aging. You can control other processes by means of concentration, by means of dhyan in a particular way, as Patanjali's Yoga Sutra in the third section, Vibhuti Pad, he mentions many of the wonderful things that one can have access to. Now, before I conclude, I also want to say that since consciousness is transcendent, and this is totally different from the Western view, and the Western view, in my judgment and through my personal experience, I would say is incorrect. It's a useful perspective. It's still a part of science, but it's incorrect because it's incomplete. If you take the Vedantic view of Atma, that it's transcendent, then one can explain why in the Indian literature there are amazing statements which have come to pass only in recent time, and for which there is no credible evidence that those statements could have been based on observations at that time. And I'll just give you a couple. One is Sayanacharya, who was the prime minister in the court of the Vijayanagara Empire, the very first prime minister, I believe, who was also a Sanskrit scholar. He wrote a commentary on the Rig Veda. And in his commentary, he speaks of the sun. This is one of the Surya Suktas. And he says, "You who travels at the speed of 2,202 Nimesha in 2,202 yojanas in half a nimesha." Now, half a nimesha, we know the divisions of day, etc., and nimesha is a part of that sequence. It's about 1/5 of a second, and yojanas is supposed to be 6,000 bow lengths, and that is about 10 miles. And if you convert 2,202 yojanas in half a nimesha, it's exactly the speed of light. And he mentions, Sayanacharya mentions it in reference to the Surya in the Surya Sukta. And what I would then say is that there was no scientific computation because there were no such equipments available at that time in India that the speed of light could have been measured. But this is how an opened mind works. This is how inspiration works. You have access to ideas. You spontaneously say something which turns out to be true. There's also a reference to the distance to the sun in the Puranas, which is absolutely correct based on modern measurements. And then, of course, more easily believable is the idea in the Vedic texts and the post-Vedic texts that the sun and the moon are each 108 times their respective diameter from the earth, which is true. Which has been confirmed by modern astronomy. But this is not that incredible, because if you take a pole of a certain height and you're looking at this setting sun, and you ask the person who's carrying that pole, P-O-L-E, to move 108 times the height of the pole away from you, its size would be the same as that of the sun, the disk of the sun or the disk of the moon. So such an experiment could have been carried out. To conclude then, Vedanta is not only consistent with quantum mechanics, which is the deepest theory of modern science, but it also goes beyond it. In other words, modern science is only scratching at certain aspects. Modern science can't explain the cosmos. Modern science can explain only 4% of the cosmos. It has to appeal to dark matter and dark energy, for which there is no experimental evidence whatsoever, and which are supposed to constitute 96% of the universe. No evidence. But so where might science go? Both in medicine, because medicine, allopathy is horribly hobbled, and 80-90% of all clinical research in allopathy in modern medical labs cannot be replicated. It's called the replicability crisis of modern medicine. You have a crisis in consciousness in computer science. Why can't computers be conscious? Well, because of Vedanta, they can't be conscious. Number three, you have the crisis of we already talked of medicine, we talked of computer science, and then neuroscience. And then how can one maybe can one then also have much more control and regulation of one's own mind and body, which would take us far beyond what has been possible. And finally, Vedanta has the promise within it that anybody can become a genius. And that should, if nothing else, this should excite people to, to get on this path of discovery of Vedanta, the heart of Sanatana Dharma, the most extraordinary, beautiful, and completely consistent, all hangs together that you can have, which is not only good for what one might be doing in one's own life, but also for one's own journey of knowing who one is.